Welcome to the second episode of the second season of Cataclysm, Dark Days Ahead, Tales from the Final Day. This series is based on a public challenge world. If you'd like to download the world and play through it as your own character, check out the link in the description. I'm on my second life out of 6 lives. Our first character got the really bad day start, which is the notoriously hard starting scenario. She unfortunately died to an infection on her leg, which the scenario starts with. Due to bad luck, there were no antibiotics spawned in her starting neighborhood to fight the infection. She looked through a dozen buildings, but before the day was through, she had become a zombie. But at least one character death is to be expected. What kind of zombie survival challenge would this be if the first attempt won the challenge? I have high hopes for our second character, named Pedro Hunger Win. My hopes aren't just high because his last name is Win, it's also because he's a home mechanic, one of my favorite ways to play. Cataclysm is a game where mechanics can be incredibly powerful. When it comes to building a barricade or fixing a car, a mechanic is exactly who you want. If Pedro can survive the first days, then my hope is that he can upgrade a powerful truck capable of mowing down entire streets of zombies and clearing out safe areas to loot and maintain his vehicle. But that is still just a distant dream. I'll need to be extremely careful as he's still on the first day, and the first day is when victory is the furthest from assured. So let's see whether Pedro Hunger Win can survive this first day, and possibly a full month, to win this season's Tales from the Final Day. For Pedro, it had been just minutes since his apocalypse had truly began. The dawn of the Cataclysm's first day was rising, and it was 5:14 a.m. Pedro had found himself in a boarded-up house without any memories of his time before. But what he did know was that the dead were rising, and if he wasn't extremely careful, he would be torn apart, shrieking in terror like so many others. So far, he had explored 2 of the neighboring houses. He had killed a zombie police dog, beating it down through its rigid Kevlar armor. Now he was back to where he started, in the mysterious home where his apocalypse began. Outside, he'd met the reality of his situation. He knew that he was in immense and fatal danger. This day ahead would be undoubtedly the most difficult day of Pedro's life. He was already in severe pain. The zombie police dog he'd fought off just seconds ago had not died easily. The lacerations from its canine jaws, covering both of his arms and his right leg, were lightly dripping with blood. He frantically searched through the things he'd looted for medical supplies and retrieved a bottle of aspirin. He took 2 of these pills and then applied a bandage to his leaking right leg. Pedro winced and seethed from the cuts, but he would have to endure for at least a few minutes until the painkillers dumbed his nerves. Pedro realized that he needed to make himself a real weapon and a set of protective armor from whatever makeshift materials he could gather if he was going to survive to see today's sunset. From his duffel bag, he pulled a hockey mask and put it on. While the mask might look menacing, for Pedro, the defensive need was more important. After all, he hadn't seen a soul alive. The world was reduced to monsters. What difference would it make if he looked like one too? The mask would protect his face from bites or scratches. He took off his torn-up jeans, which had been shredded by the zombie police dog, and put on a new pair. He unloaded his loot from having scavenged next door onto a table. As he peeked through the curtains, he could see that the sun was just beginning to rise. The streets were coated in a dim light. Pedro decided that this would be his only chance to climb up onto a roof and see what was nearby before the sun forced him into hiding. Pedro climbed out into the alley and up a drain pipe onto the neighboring roof. From up here, he could see quite a distance. To the northeast, a field led to a forest. To the south, southwest, and west, the city he was in continued on. He was surrounded by 3 blocks of residential houses, but if he had to run, he could run out of the city and into the forests, where the zombies were unlikely to be in large numbers. Pedro climbed back down the drain pipe into the alley. Before returning to his home to hide through the day, he peeked out in front of the homes to get a look at the street. The zombies here were fairly sparse, nothing to be immediately worried about. He climbed back over the windowsill into the safety of the boarded-up house. He'd need to pass this day indoors, preparing himself for combat and being as invisible as possible. Once the sun sets, he could go on a scavenging run for food and other supplies, but for now, he was underprepared for the horrors outside. In his past life, Pedro Wynn was a home mechanic. He had a special aptitude for working with household materials to solve practical problems. Today's practical problems involved killing the undead and preventing having your head torn off. Pedro broke apart a stool and fashioned its sturdy legs into a cudgel with a weighted head. It was a quick bashing weapon which he could use while fighting defensively. He figured he would wait for a zombie to get in range, smash the cudgel down on it, and step away. He practiced the move, making sure to etch it into his muscle memory. He looked over his things. For a while, he was stumped as to what he could make. But then a moment of creative inspiration struck. Using some duct tape and loose paper sheets, he put together a set of leg guards made of office paper and duct tape. By folding the duct tape over on itself to become a durable ribbon and cutting the paper to become a set of 1/4-inch thick sheets, he created a practical set of armor. Now, Cataclysm's realism is something that many fans love about the game, and one piece of funny realism is just how resilient and inventive paper armor can actually be. Although obviously a single sheet of paper is easily ripped, with even 24 pieces of paper, it becomes a durable yet flexible and light material. If you're still hesitant to think of paper as a decent material for armor, then think of it this way. If you have a book nearby, imagine trying to bite or scratch through that book to the other side. Think about how many sheets of paper would be needed at minimum before you wouldn't be able to bite through it at all. It's less than around 20 sheets to protect from a bite wound. Paper armor is suited especially well against light attacks, such as the scratches and bites of a zombie. Paper is a material that is so common that you can probably find enough of it for a full set of armor within your own house. Of course, it won't be enough protection against grappling or stronger attacks like punches, or even really nasty bites from some of the more powerful zombies Cataclysm has, like those crocodile-faced zombies, but it's an excellent armor against light attacks that can be quickly and easily put together. He had just enough material for a set of leg guards so far, but he could probably find some more paper in the house's basement office. Still wincing from the pain, he took another aspirin as well as a dose of codeine. He wanted to be painless for at least a little while in case he were ambushed. In the basement, he took apart the washer and dryer, removing a rubber tube from the washer. With this tube, he could siphon fuel from a car into any container. Fuel could be used to power a car or for Molotovs. Pedro took apart a bed, moving one of its mattress pads into the hallway. This pad could slow a zombie down, enough for him to beat it down while it struggled to stand. He tore up a Dungeons & Dragons character sheet he found in the basement, as well as some receipts. He wanted to make paper arm guards, too. He also decided to tear up a big book called Antique Adornments. It was about jewelry. He probably wouldn't ever need it. But just as he was assembling the paper arm guards, one of the windows to his living room was shattered. He looked over, his heart pumping as the situation changed instantly, from relative calm to sheer terror. The zombie pulled itself through the broken window's curtains, tearing them down as light flooded into the room. A zombie was bad, but the light that now exposed the entire room to any zombies out on the streets was worse. Light meant that the zombies outside would easily spot him. Pedro backed into the kitchen, where it was still dark, as the fat zombie approached him. He lured the fat zombie into the kitchen as he moved to the opposite side of a counter in the middle of the room. The fat zombie pushed up against the counter, its sagging arms outstretched. Pedro lifted his cudgel and beat it to death. Pedro crouched, then went up to the dining room window. He wouldn't be able to just hang the curtain back up. The window itself had been destroyed. He would need to take the time to board up this entire window frame. Pedro dragged a dresser in front of the window. He'd need to gather materials to board it back up. But that instant, a brainless zombie suddenly broke through the last bits of glass in that window and wandered into the room. It was missing the top half of its head and couldn't see at all. It must have heard the commotion from the window shattering. He kept to the shadows and moved towards the sightless zombie. It still had ears and could hear him, so he decided to lead it away from the light by shuffling a chair around. Then Pedro struck out at it. It reached for him, grasping him as he tore himself free and back into the kitchen. There it wandered onto the counter, and Pedro beat it to death. He left the two bodies in the kitchen for now. He'd need to pulp them before tomorrow. If possible, he'd bring them outside tonight before pulping them so as not to make more of a mess in the kitchen. The living room window was still open to the street, and although the dresser protected much of the house from being seen from outdoors, it was still an easy opening. Pedro decided to quickly finish his paper arm guards. More zombies were probably coming, and he'd need to be as well protected as possible. And with the damage done to the house, he may even need to run out into the daylight if things got too bad. He continued to craft the arm guards as he spotted a decayed zombie meandering in the distance outside. He kept on working. Pedro needed to keep himself hidden. If he could pass time easily to the night, he would be able to head out and perhaps find a better defensive building. The painkillers and codeine were working their magic. He felt painless as he took apart more of the furniture in the kitchen. The extra furniture would be more useful as spare parts. As soon as he could board up more of the windows. There were still at least 8 unprotected windows here. As he worked, he heard a banging on one of the boarded up windows. He shut his flashlight off. Whatever was out there was fully capable of breaking in at any instant. He wasn't about to go outside to confront it. All he could do was wait for it to inevitably get inside and then kill it, hoping the noise didn't bring too many more. Pedro dragged a dresser through the hall and into the dining room as the zombie continued to bash at the boarded window. He'd need to put this dresser in place to block sight once it had broken in. As he pulled the dresser through the house, a decayed zombie heard the commotion and started to walk into the open living room. Pedro lured it back into the kitchen and killed it like the others. He put the dresser in place, which blocked some sight lines, but still some light spilled in. There were now 4 corpses in the kitchen, but each was one less zombie in the neighborhood. In this house, he could at least control the flow of undead to a level that didn't exhaust him, where he could put them down without being overrun. Many zombie stories and games prefer to ignore describing the stink that zombies have. It's hard to tolerate the smell of a rotting fellow human. Deep in genetic memory, the smell of death reminds you to stay away, far away from the rotting dead. There was no way that Pedro could tolerate 4 dead, rotting corpses in his kitchen all day long. It was just 9:37 a.m., and Pedro was a man with high standards. He took one last breath of clean air, then headed into the rank kitchen to haul the undead corpses outdoors. He lifted each dead body just enough that it wasn't immobilized by friction and pulled it down the hall to a window that led to the alley outside. He opened the curtains, then the window, and shunted the corpses over the windowsill. The body was incapacitated, but he could swear he had felt it shudder. He'd need to pulp them soon. But just as the second body slumped into the alley, Pedro heard glass shatter. From just across the alley in the window facing towards him, a zombie dog was jumping, ramming its body into the glass. Pedro wouldn't be able to just leave that dog there. He had to put it down before it broke more windows. He peeked down the alley and saw that there was just one decayed zombie that had spotted him far away. He climbed out into the alleyway, wielding his cudgel. The zombie dog went down in a single critical hit. With the dog taken out, Pedro had a few precious seconds to pulp the dead bodies in the alley. He beat them with his cudgel and the bodies stopped moving entirely. Pedro climbed back through the window. He went to drag the next body out of the kitchen. Just as he rounded the corner of the hall, a zombie that must have climbed in through the open window lunged at him. He rushed back down the hall, just beyond the mattress he'd placed in the hallway for this purpose. The zombie stumbled towards him down the hall and tripped onto the mattress. Immediately, Pedro began beating the monster down. He managed to completely incapacitate it without taking any damage. He lifted the twitching corpse and shoved it out of the window, taking the time to pulp it without being seen in the alley. Just as Pedro was walking back towards the kitchen, outside the window he spotted movement. A zombie clad in SWAT gear lumbered outside in the alley, spotting him through the window. He could fight the armored zombie, but he'd need to be careful. The thing was protected by high-tech armor that was designed for much worse than his cudgel. But he'd killed an armored police dog. He could probably take a SWAT zombie too. It climbed over the window and stumbled onto the nearby desk. Pedro opened up on it with his cudgel, landing a range of light hits and heavy critical strikes. The zombie steadied itself and retaliated by tearing through Pedro's paper arm guards. The wound started to leak faintly with blood, coloring the paper red. Pedro needed to reset the skirmish and get himself back into control. He stepped back, waiting for the zombie to come to him. It staggered again, falling back onto the desk. Pedro went in for the kill, bashing the zombie repeatedly. It could only retaliate with a few weak punches as Pedro beat at it until it collapsed, its armored SWAT suit leaking blood onto the wooden floor. But even as the fight ended, Pedro still heard the sounds of hands beating a boarded window. The sound was coming from behind him, a window obscured by a curtain. He stepped into the alley to see 2 zombies. They shattered the glass and entered the house as Pedro retreated back into the hall. A decayed zombie pursued him into the kitchen, grabbing at him as he tried to get the zombie up onto the counter where it could be immobilized. Finally, he managed to get the thing stuck as it rushed over the counter, grasping for him. Pedro struck out with a flurry of strikes from his club, and the thing splay out dead across the counter. There was still 1 zombie left in the other room. He caught his breath here in the darkness, almost retching from the smell of too many zombies that had been killed in this room today. He wanted to reassure himself that it was almost over, but it was still only 9:51 a.m. The most difficult day of Pedro's life had only barely begun. He went around the front of the house to find the second zombie that had been at the window. It was outside now, but rapidly pulled its fat body over the windowsill to get at him. He was so easy to spot in any room that had a broken window. The house was being torn apart. Luring the beast into the kitchen, he moved to the opposite side of the counter and waited for the thing to come straight at him, immobilizing itself on the counter and putting its head out at an easy position for him to strike. The zombie managed to land some light ashes on him as he struck out at its teeth. He reoriented around the table and put the thing down. His 10th kill. Pedro was proving an efficient zombie killer. He'd need to be if he was going to last this day on just the supplies in this one house. He only had one bandage, aside from the one that he had already applied to his mildly wounded right leg. There were still zombies to move out of the kitchen. He dragged them out one by one. He removed the SWAT armor from the dead zombie. He couldn't wear it unless he cleaned it, but the Kevlar was both light and highly resistant, even bulletproof. It could easily handle a zombie bite, and being shot at was a remote possibility. The Kevlar would come in handy, and he might be able to clean it soon. He had a washboard, but he needed a lot of water to be able to clean the SWAT suit. He went to the bathroom to see how much water was left in the toilet's reservoir. He'd need about 2 toilets worth of water total. That would be an exchange that meant spending days of water for a clean SWAT suit. He wasn't ready to make that trade yet. But it gave him another mission. When he had an ample supply of water, he could clean this SWAT suit. For now, he left it aside. There was nothing but time, and so Pedro stood in the hallway, in a place that was just lit enough to be able to read his book, Eat Your Way to a Fit Physique. Focusing on the lines of text helped him calm himself. It was 11:12 a.m. now. He noticed movement out the window as a tough zombie staggered in. He put the book down and rushed towards it with his cudgel. Backing it towards the coffee table, he took it down, before dragging it outside the window and making sure it was dead. Back to reading, to calm his nerves and pass time. Just minutes later, another fat zombie was in the living room with him. He took his sling pack off, but not fast enough before it rushed at him with a sprint and landed a bite on his right arm, fortunately not deep enough to infect. He backed away and lit it onto the mattress before putting it down and dragging it out to the alley to destroy. He was thirsty and went into the kitchen. There was no water at the ready. He decided to crack open a pale ale and eat a kiwi as well as a mushy orange. Then it was back to reading to pass the time and ease his nerves. He heard some banging from the other front room, and seconds later another zombie entered his sight. He rushed beyond the hallway mattress, dropped his sling pack as the zombie rushed towards him. Too slow, it was able to get a bite on his leg guards as it toppled over the mattress. Damn, he'd need to be more careful with dropping his pack. This was the second time now he dropped it too late. He rushed back into the kitchen as the zombie immobilized itself on the counter. He hit the thing with his bare hands, panicking and dumbly fumbling for his cudgel. He rushed forward as the zombie grabbed him. If he kept being this foolish, he'd be dead before long. It was a painful reminder that Pedro needed to be more careful if he was going to survive this deadly world. Back to reading, and another zombie rounded the corner. He met it as it stumbled over the chairs and table beside the open window, dragged it outside and pulped it. More reading, more waiting. It was 5:15 p.m. now. Another zombie showed up and he put it down too. Then another and another. He went into the kitchen and ate a dozen spoonfuls of jam. His condition was beyond depraved. Forced to take shelter in a disgusting kitchen, holding back from retching as he ate spoonfuls of sugary mashed fruit. He tried to remind himself that it was nearly sundown, just a little longer. He decided that when the sun set, he would run away. He couldn't stand this house another day. This house was absolute hell. It was here that Pedro lost a part of him, his innocence, that he could never get back. Part of him envied the undead, because they were no longer terrified. The resolution to soon leave fortified his mental state. Just a little longer. If he could get through this, he could get through anything. He thought about where he could run to. He had options. There was an apartment tower just a block away. So long as he could climb the stairwell, he could get himself above all this chaos down at street level. The other option was to run into the woods, leaving the city entirely. He could try for the apartment tower, and if he ran into trouble, he would take option B, the forest. He had also spotted a large power substation off towards the north at the edge of the woods, just across a highway. As a mechanic, there was a lot of potential at that substation for him. Pedro was very thirsty. He looked over the fridge and saw only his hated soft drinks. He needed something actually hydrating. He'd need to boil the water in the toilet. He grabbed some wooden planks and put them into the stove. There was no running power, but he could start a fire in there. A stove was meant to be hot, and to seal heat away from flammable things. He lit the fire with his butane lighter, and soon the stove had a burning flame inside. He grabbed one of the plastic bottles of pop from the fridge and poured the devil's liquid out onto the ground. Then he went into the bathroom and scooped water from the toilet's back tank. He poured the water into a copper pot, then opened the window and put the pot inside. Once it had boiled, he took the water out and poured it back into the plastic bottle. Pedro repeated this for a total of 4 regular plastic bottles and 1 large one. He hoped to have even 2 days of hydration now. It was 7:57 p.m. Before long, the sun would go down and he could leave this wretched place behind. With the water bottles in his sling pack, Pedro felt like he might just make it. It had been hours since he'd had to fight his last zombie. This grueling day was nearly over. He was nearly able to leave the house. Pedro went around his items, making sure to pick up anything he thought useful. He took carrots, the jar of jam, and a bottle of maple syrup from the fridge. He grabbed a frying pan and his copper pot. He picked up a medium battery, a handheld battery charger, and another battery charger he could connect to a vehicle. He was paranoid for whether a zombie would enter. It was 8 p.m. Soon, the sun would start to set. As he passed through the house, he spotted something outside that was even more disturbing. It moved faster than the zombie and stood upright, but something was clearly wrong. It looked alive. A feral human stood in the middle of the street between himself and the apartment tower. When he left tonight, he planned to go a different way and avoid the street. He was tired, but too paranoid to sleep. Soon, he would be making his escape. Just a little longer. He paced between the kitchen and the hall, waiting for another zombie to come into the house. But none did. The light began to shrink away as the sun fell. Shadows became longer, cloaking the home's interior once again in safe shadows. Pedro could hardly believe it. He'd survived the longest day of his life. But the day wasn't over yet. He needed to make it to the apartment building before he could feel safe. And that meant heading out into danger and leaving the boarded-up home behind. He went through the bathroom window, which led to the back of the house away from the street. Just as he lowered himself to the grassy ground, a zombie rounded the corner and came at him. Damn, he'd be forced to run right from the very beginning. He took off at a quick sprint, then tried to walk as much as possible. Whenever the zombie became too close, he sprinted a few steps and returned to a walk. Ahead, a narrow space between the houses had a SWAT zombie waiting, not yet noticing him. He'd need to get uncomfortably close to get through. The thing must have smelled him. The SWAT zombie closed the distance as Pedro rushed past. Now he had 2 zombies following. He kept the pace as he headed out onto the street. The street was the halfway point to the apartments, but as he saw the amount of zombies ahead, he realized that the second half would be the most difficult. He passed a metal garage door. There were about 6 zombies following him now. 7, then 8. He focused on keeping his distance. Then ahead, he saw another of the unsettling figures. This one also stood upright, coated in blood. It was standing so still, it looked alive. He tried to keep his distance, but between this feral human and the other, he was beginning to panic. Trying to keep away, the zombies were getting too close, too numerous. There was a zombie dead ahead of him, too. Avoiding it meant the others would catch up just a little more. He was grabbed from behind, but yanked himself free, taking a bite to his arm, which was protected by his paper armor. This was it. He hoped his preparation would be enough to get him through. His breath was getting more heavy. It would only get worse. He saw the first feral human he'd spotted coming closer, the back of his neck itching with fear as he noticed the feral human's deranged eyes. Then, with murderous intent, the feral threw a rock at him, hitting his torso and winding him just a little more. He was still in the intersection. This couldn't be it. He can't die here. Trying to keep distance and pull himself free from grabs, he pulled on. Another rock pelted him in the left arm. The second feral had lost him, but this other one was too close. He made for a house across the street. It had to have a drain pipe he could climb to get away from this. His breathing was coarse and desperate. With his last reserve of energy, he hauled himself up and away from the zombies. He prepared himself to fight the feral if it climbed up the drain pipe after him. It didn't. He flashed his flashlight on, scanning the rooftop for any unknown danger. It was safe up here. He could catch his breath. He crossed to the other side of the roof and climbed down a drain pipe. It was much darker now, and he could hardly see a meter ahead. Grass turned to sidewalk, then into pavement. He heard footsteps behind him. He kept on towards the direction of the apartment. He was almost blind, but so were the undead. He traced the wall of a house and moved beyond it as a zombie pursued him. A drain pipe. He climbed up onto the roof of this house beside the apartment tower. He flashed his flashlight on. The tower was so close to this home's roof. He had an idea. If he broke the window, he could leap across and get into the tower without needing to enter the bottom floor or its stairwell. He looked through the windows. There didn't seem to be any threats inside. He smashed a vent on top of the roof and threw the loose pipe across, shattering the window. Now, to jump across. He dropped his heavy bags. He would bring them over one by one. Then, Pedro Hunger Wynn leapt across the alley, into the apartment tower's kitchen. This sort of feat would have been unimaginable to him just a day ago. When he got inside, he removed his armor, including his heavy pants, and leapt back to get the other 2 bags. Back and forth, he hopped the gap until him and all his possessions were inside the apartment. He flashed on his light and looked around. He didn't dare look into the hallway yet. He was safer than he'd been since this cataclysm had begun. The day had been the most terrifying, shocking, and harrowing day of his life. He felt drained of energy, but he was alive, and the odds were beginning to favor him. Pedro Hunger Wynn may just survive. But that is enough for this episode of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead, Tales from the Final Day. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I give a lot of film recommendations with the clips I use, but I'd also like to give a great zombie book recommendation. I'm reading through David Moody's Autumn the City. It's excellent, chilling zombie survival that follows multiple characters as they attempt to survive together despite the horrors of a zombie apocalypse. What I like about Moody's writing is that he puts a lot of attention into the reality of the story he's telling. Here's a quote from him. I get frustrated by the restraints of society and how we all unwittingly conform, doing what's expected of us in the way we're expected to do it. We're constantly being manipulated and told what to do and what to think, and as a result, most folks just comply. The apocalypse, though, is where everything changes. For another zombie author, you might like Myra Grant's Newsflesh series. It's a trilogy of books based in a post-apocalyptic world where America has survived and democracy is just as dysfunctional as ever. It follows the political campaign of a post-apocalyptic presidential election. Here's a quote from her. Keep in mind, this is from the year of 2012. "No one respects quarantine anymore. Nobody comprehends quarantine, and absolutely nobody comprehends the fact that sometimes your rights and liberties do not have any place in this conversation. We have totally drug-resistant tuberculosis. And what do people with totally drug-resistant tuberculosis do? Do they lock themselves in their houses for the rest of their lives? Do they eat a bullet? No. They get on airplanes, and then they get pissed off when the CDC yells at them. Quarantine exists so that we can continue as a species to exist. And yes, it sucks if I say to you, dude, really sorry, had to shoot your wife, had the totally drug-resistant tuberculosis, yo. But you know what sucks more? Killing an elementary school because you went outside with your totally drug-resistant tuberculosis. That's what I love about Myra Grant. She's a fun author. So anyways, thanks again for listening and watching, and do check out the films and books I recommend if you're hungry for more zombie content. And until next time, take care, be well, and I look forward to the next episode of Cataclysm, Dark Days Ahead, Tales from the Final Day.